Welcome back to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. My name's Chandler Fleming. I'm the owner and chief therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling here in Clarkston.
And I am Victoria Fleming, his wife, and I am owner and therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling as well. Welcome to the show, and today we're looking at bad news.
Bad news, bad news. What you gonna do?
It's
a tough subject.
It is. It's a tough subject, and I can hear that song from Bad Boys, Bad Boys. But you know, it does feel like it's bad news, and we are left with what are we gonna do?
Sure.
I mean, you turn on the radio, you turn on the television, it just feels like it's, you know, it permeates.
Right. And it just begs the song "Dirty Laundry." You know, in our media today with 24-hour coverage. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. And it's just one of those situations that we have to kind of face up to. It could feel overwhelming at times, but
yeah, it can, absolutely.
There's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world.
And it is fascinating that Dirty Laundry song will come up in my head. And you do think about how people can be drawn, but I can't help but wonder if we've shifted, and it's social media, it's just everywhere. You know, it seems like in some ways maybe it was just the news there for a while, but now that the social media has picked up with Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, and you know, it seems like information is found out so quickly and sometimes without all the facts and information. And so it just feels like bad news, and what am I going to do? And that's very much what we want to look at today. And as we reflect on 2017, Chandler, gosh, it was a big year. There was a lot of tragedies. There were multiple hurricanes and shootings.
Yeah.
You know, I hate to say it, but I overheard the news one day this week, and it wasn't if you encounter a public shooting, it was a when you, that we need to start. You know, I found myself thinking about smoke or fire drills.
Yeah.
And how people, you have a plan for your house, this is what you're going to do. You have a plan for the school, you have a plan for your building. And I think that public shootings have become frequent enough, you know, that we are looking at what are we going to do.
Right.
So
being prepared. But being prepared, how are we going to handle the news?
Right. So as we are in the onslaught of bad news, you know, we wanted to take a look at what are some of the emotions that we do feel. I don't think we always know what's a normal, healthy emotion when you hear something tragic, and so we wanted to take a look at that.
You know, and I frequently tell people that they're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And it is normal to feel angry or sad or helpless or frustrated, or even having just kind of a sense of being survivor guilt, a relief that, hey, that's so horrible it happened to them. I'm glad it wasn't my family. I'm glad it wasn't me.
And it ends up triggering this awful sense of like, oh, I shouldn't feel that way. But there is a protective part of us that's like, we ache for the school where the shooting happened, and yet we hug our children closer with a sense of relief. And that can trigger some feelings of guilt and some feelings of there's something wrong with me. But I do think we need to appreciate that that's normal. You know, that it's normal to feel like, oh, thank you that, you know, you're okay. Thank you weren't part of the pileup that happened on 75. And so let's just recognize the fact that if you hear something tragic and you're feeling angry, you're feeling protective, you're feeling sad, then that's a normal thing to feel. But we have to be careful that we don't shift into some unhealthy coping, you know, or allowing those feelings to become dominant in a way that's not healthy. You know, so some of those would be when we begin to internalize it, instead of processing it at all, we just begin to internalize, and that could even be like a stuffing. And if we're not careful, for some people that can lead to volcanic later.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not good.
Or ulcers, or just the internal burning.
Or a high blood pressure, and some other things. Some people will become bitter. You know, really bitter, becoming overwhelmed, becoming fatalistic, and shutting down. So Taylor, let's kind of take a look. How do we find that balance between, gosh, I'm angry, but not being overwhelmed by the anger. Gosh, I'm so sad, but not becoming overwhelmed. What do you see with that?
You know, I think it's really important for us to look at our history and see what are some of the things in the past that may have been similar, and being able to differentiate the difference. You know what? If I got in a car accident and got sued, and that was my experience. I might see a car accident or be in another car accident and think the very same thing's going to happen. So we got to kind of look and see and separate. You know what? This is different than last time. This is not the same thing. This is not what's going on. We need to admit hopelessness and helplessness, that there are some things that are outside our control. And there can be a relief in that.
Yeah, isn't it funny? I think so often it's just being able to identify and recognize. You know, I know you guys, meaning the kids in you, have sometimes wanted to shield me, you know, because you do know that I can have a tendency to feel things very deeply, especially the mom things, you know.
She cries at Hallmark commercials.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and so I can, and so I do. I have to be really aware and kind of scale and recognize one, my sincere feeling of grief is really a normal reaction, but I do have to be very careful that I monitor and weigh, am I going from grieving and maybe looking for something that I can do to help, even if it's just pray, to feeling so overwhelmed that I almost want to shut down.
Yeah.
You know, and I do, I think, and I appreciate what you said, that I think it can trigger, if something like that has ever happened before, I think it can a little bit trigger a reaction of Murphy's Law, oh no, it's going to happen again. And we have to be careful of that.
You know, and what's ironic about it is oftentimes in an effort to avoid the pain of a situation or avoid being caught up in it again, we do things that make it more likely.
Now, how so? What do you mean by that?
Well, in particular, I was thinking is a gentleman I know who his first wife was unfaithful to him, and they ended up getting a divorce. But in his second marriage, he says things like, "I will never love her the same way. I'll never be that same vulnerable. I'll never give myself completely like I did in the past." Mm-hmm. And what that does is he draws back, so his spouse draws back also, and she senses that he's not giving. So what happens is the disconnect between the two of them get larger and larger and larger, because that fear of the past, that fear of the bad news, causes them to withdraw, and then it's more likely for it to happen.
And that's where that I can feel helpless or maybe hopeless can shift into, now I'm feeling fatalistic.
Right.
You know, and like we set ourselves up for guardedness, that we're not enjoying the moments and savoring what is happening, you know, because it can feel like the bad news is all we're hearing, you know, that the dirty laundry is what get it. But we do need to remember that in the midst of even the World Trade Centers being hit, and that was such a tragedy, and we were watching so incessantly, you know, that there were also people that were having babies in hospitals, and, you know, that their anniversaries in all around on that day and all around the days that follow, that there were also good things, they just didn't get as much news necessarily.
So avoiding that tunnel vision and looking at all the facts and looking at all the news of that day can be hugely important.
And I know you and I had talked about how for each person it's going to be different, you know.
Sure.
So some of the things we're going to look at that you need to do to be careful as you've turned on the radio and it's a news flash, you know, active shooter in the area, and that actually did happen yesterday.
Yes.
Active shooter in the area, you know, so it's not just happening in Las Vegas, it's not just on the London Bridge, it's just not happening at concerts, you know, it does happen in our area, which does make it a little scarier and does cause a person to maybe feel a little more helpless and a little more out of control, but that we do need to take a look. Different ones of us are going to process that information differently, but all of us at some level need to take a break from the media onslaught.
And it's usually a bad sign in coping that if we're so inundated with it and we can't break away from the TV and we're constantly looking for that information, that's a sign that you may be obsessed. If you're watching TV 24/7, and you know, on balance, I did watch the World Trade thing for hours and hours, but in the days that followed, it was less and less. And I did take breaks, and I did go to bed that night. And I know lots of people, when tragedy strikes, when bad news strikes, they just kind of dig in. So you got to find some balance.
And it's kind of fascinating because I think at first it is almost like an investigate, like the brain is in that paralysis of this can't be true.
Sure.
You know, because I know recently for me there was something that's so sad in our community that it happened, and it first broke out on social media, and there was nothing concrete in the news. And I did find myself fairly regularly, maybe a little incessantly, wanting to look and see, is this true, is this true, is this true? I was looking for that confirmation. And when I did finally see the obituary, then I knew. But it was a sense of trying to make sense of it, you know, and I needed that. And once I knew that it was factual, then it allowed my mind to shift from maybe some paralysis of disbelief into, okay, now what? And then I did take a break, you know, and again, it wasn't like constant, but I was regularly checking. And then once I was able to take a break, I was able to look at what now.
Right. And a big part of that is to do something. And a lot of times people will ask me, especially like children and so forth, you know, around the World Trade Center, a lot of people ask me, you know, my kids saw that on TV. What should I do? How can I help my kids? And a lot of times it is do something.
Absolutely.
It's write a letter. It's lead a blood drive. It's really do actions. For your kids, have them draw pictures, have them write cards, have them be involved. And that's one of the ways that we cope with tragedy and bad news, is really to be activated and do something. And sometimes it's directly related to that event. We do something to send cards or money, but sometimes it's just do something, exercise, go create something, go work out, you know, clean the house is sometimes a way that we effectively cope with the bad news.
And it's interesting too, because the do something also has another angle of look at those people who are doing something, because I think our mind does get into the tunnel vision that is all bad.
Yeah.
But really when you look at, to use the World Trade Center again, it was fascinating how the first estimates of how many people had lost their lives was way, I think 10 times greater than what it actually was. If I'm not mistaken, it was like they were assuming 30,000.
Yes.
And yet when we started hearing the stories of how people were caught on the freeway, had a child sick and stayed at home, that there were all of these unusual circumstances, not to mention all of the rescue workers who were just flooding in, when people were able to kind of balance from the bad news to some of the rescue stories, to some of the ways that people were helping and how the community was already rising up, it provided some balance for the mind. And then instead of it being an overwhelm of the bad, we were able to kind of balance it, but like, wow, look at the firefighters and the police officers, and look at all the people, the American Red Cross and all the people who are coming in, and the mind is able to make some sense on what is being done. Yeah. You know, and it does, it empowers us. It gives us a sense of control and not feeling so helpless. Right. In a situation that can feel incredibly helpless. You know, it really can. So, so we're looking at, you know, do something, limit yours, do something. Be sure to talk.
Yes.
You know, and recognize maybe not everyone wants to talk.
Yeah, don't talk too much, but you know, do talk.
Like, I'm a processor. I want to talk. So if you don't want to talk, I mean, you need to call a friend.
That's right.
You know, but do recognize that those feelings are not abnormal, and that you can, I think we can sometimes feel like there's something wrong with me, and when I can understand you're mad too. Sure. You're really furious about that too, so I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. Right. You know, or you're really sad about that too, then there's something, again, empowering or normalizing about what's going on with me.
Yeah. And you know, we're put on this earth for each other, and being able to share that burden and be able to talk it through is so important.
It really is.
Trying to pull together.
And I think something that's super fascinating is, in the midst of tragedy has come, you know, we have it listed as beauty from ash, and it's just that kind of that concept of the phoenix rising, you know, from the ashes. But it is fascinating how, because of really bad things, really tragic things, there have been powerful things that have come from it. Right. You know, and some of those, even though in and of itself, the Amber Alert obviously is surrounding something that is heartbreaking that's going on. But because the Amber Alert was started, there have been people found. You know, there have been rescues made, and out of someone having something tragic happen, they looked at how can I rescue other families? What can I do? Sad and mad, moms against drunk driving, students against drunk driving. In fact, I think distracted driving, you know, that something positive ends up up coming from someone else's tragedy. And that is a way of looking at, how can I move from feeling overwhelmed? How can I move from feeling helpless to being able to do something? You know, I think you had even mentioned as we were talking Chicago, what was it that you were saying, how Chicago, that it did end up being literal beauty that came from ashes?
You know, and a lot of things do happen that way. The Chicago fire is, you know, it was a devastating event, but because of the fire, they had all this clean land, this area that they could definitely go in and rebuild and, you know, put up skyscrapers because, you know, they didn't have to worry about land ownership. The fire destroyed everything. And there are some things that legitimately good things take place. Oftentimes think about the concept of a diamond. What does it take? Coal, heat, and pressure.
Right.
And sometimes in our lives, those things that heat and pressure and stuff can make us into a better person. And a lot of times those afflictions, those negative things, it can either make us a better person or a bitter person.
And we want to avoid the bitter. And in fact, it was interesting. We went to Glacier National Park. It was really interesting how the ranger was telling us, people see the fires, and I know there have been wildfires, as all negative, but she said that when they had the fires there in Glacier National Park, that there was actually, in that, I guess farmers and Indians have used fires often to be able to clean. It's like what you were saying with Chicago. It's a clean sweep. It's a change in the whole outlay of the land, but then that there's this new growth. And with this new growth, there's a difference in wildlife, and that there's a new beauty that can take place. So for those who have encountered the wildfires that have been happening, there is the promise of some beauty that's going to come from the ashes, literally, you know, and that there will be refreshing and restoring. You know, I know even the Vibram souls came from, there was a tragic climbing fall, and so one of the individuals that had survived went on a mission on how can we make climbing boots better. You know, the use of red, yellow, and green lights very much came from tragedy happening and someone looking at, okay, red and green, too fast, not working, what can we do? And the yellow light came. Caution, be aware, and lives have been saved. Airbags came from tragedy and people looking at, and so again, that's where we go from having the normal reaction that's healthy, preventing the unhealthy and just becoming fixated and stuck, and looking at a way to become empowered and to do something.
Yeah, and I think in my personal life, two of the biggest career moves I made came out of something negative. I was at a place that downsized and let people go. And when I left that place, it wasn't a happy day. But I moved on to a job that I loved a ton times better. And the last career choice I made or change I made, you know, things became apparent that it was time for me to move on. And it wasn't the timing that I would have picked.
Right.
But because of that bad event, good things did come out of it.
So, you know, so as we take a look at this, I don't know that we're going to be able to avoid bad news. In fact, I'm fairly sure we're not going to be able to avoid bad news, because even if all the media went out, if we ended up in some sort of electric shutdown within our own neighborhoods, we've had that here in Clarkston. We're in our own neighborhood. I do think we need to recognize that the bad news have gotten bigger, because prior to the media, the bad news was at least limited to our local. You know, and now we have in our back door the local, the state, the international, you know, the national, the international, we absolutely know about. So we're not going to be able to avoid the bad news. Bad news is unavoidable, whether it's personal and right underneath your own roof or it's within your neighborhood. Bad news is unavoidable. But let's look at, in conclusion, what are some things that we can do? And the very first one is, again, just recognize, limit the intake. You know, and limiting that intake may be different. You know, for you, you may only need a 5-minute break in the intake and just go out and get the mail and come back and you're okay to go right back to it. You know, for me, it may be that I should only be watching 5 minutes. And that's it per day, because it's just too much. You know, so let's take a look at limit the intake. Take time to process.
Take that time, talk it out, don't stuff the emotions, and then do something. Either do something related to the event or do something just as a distraction from the event. And try to do something positive, even if it's just cleaning the house.
Absolutely. Give blood. The American Red Cross is regularly looking for people who can give blood. And even though, and I know that very often the Red Cross will be flooded with people suddenly willing to give blood.
Yes.
And that blood may not go to the people that are facing the immediate crisis, but it's going to go to someone.
Right.
And it's going to go to someone in need.
Turn it into something positive.
Yeah, so do something. Do communicate. Talk to other people. Again, that lone wolf, that isolating yourself just is not healthy. We really are in this together. We really are, and I think that that's something that we do very often see when there is a tragedy that is actually beautiful. It can even be not a tragedy, but just an event like there's a blizzard and all the electricity off, and then suddenly the neighbors get to know each other because they're coming out and saying, hey, you got enough wood, or hey, I've got a Coleman stove, I can make some hot coffee for you. And we choose to benefit from it.
Sure.
And so let's take a look at, when you hear bad news, what are you going to do? Let's look at what we can do that is going to benefit ourselves, benefit our community, benefit the world, because there are things we can do that benefit the world.
Oh, sure.
Red lights are benefiting the world. Airbags are benefiting the world.
Sure.
And just recognize that we're not in this alone. So let's reach out, let's benefit other people. So any closing comments?
Just really look at the whole picture. That when the bad news comes flooded in, hear the whole news, not just the bad news.
Do a little bit of investigating.
Yep.
So.
Thank you so very much for watching today. We really appreciate you people that out there that are watching us. Please send in ideas that you have for shows. Send in questions. We'd be glad to answer them on the air.
We just so appreciate your help in getting the news out there. And again, thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you much.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.